Okay, so thank you, Madison, and welcome to, it looks like Shalini and Hillary as well. I'm here with my colleague, Mike Metzler. We are at Georgia State University in downtown Atlanta. We're actually not far from you, Hillary. So, and I am now going to start by sharing my screen, and we are going to talk about summing up the 2020 transition to emergency remote instruction in one word. But part of this discussion is going to include a research study examining what happened during the remote transition at different institutions in the state of Georgia. So during the transition to remote teaching, my colleague Mike Metzler pulled together a Georgia ISSOTL Research Consortium group to investigate what was happening on different campuses so that we can understand how students and instructors transitioned to remote teaching. And we're using the term remote teaching because it was truly being defined as the way we would design online synchronous or asynchronous courses. There are 26 institutions in the university system of Georgia, and 6 institutions participated in the study, and from those different institutions there were 13 members of the consortium. And these schools ranged from R1, so research intensive universities, to technical colleges and state colleges. During the spring of 2020, we know that over 90% of higher education institutions in the U.S. made this emergency transition to all remote instruction. And what I'd like you to do is sort of think back now when that term ended, the spring 2020 semester ended for you at your institution. If you were to pick a word that would summarize that time for you, what would it have been at that time? And would love for you to just pop the word that comes to mind that you were thinking then. If you could just pop that word into the chat, that would be great. So what we did, our ISSOTL consortium, we designed survey instruments for both instructors and students. We got quick IRB approval at all of our institutions. We validated the content of the surveys, and then we came up with a plan to distribute the surveys and what kinds of messages we would include and reminders. The window for collecting the data opened May 11th in 2020 and it closed June 19th. And with this, I'd like to say that everyone was under the same instructions from the University System of Georgia about what it would look like to transition following similar rules. However, how each institution implemented supporting faculty and doing training for faculty and students varied and differed. We're just going to go through a little bit of the background information on who completed these surveys and focus first on instructors of record. For their responses to be included in our study, they had to accept the informed consent information. We verified that they taught at least one course that transitioned to an all remote instruction modality, and that they completed the transition description for at least one course. We had 910 eligible instructor of record completers. So almost 1,000 instructors completed the survey, and they came from all academic ranks, from new junior faculty all the way up to full professors and faculty, and also the non-tenure track teaching positions. Over 50% of them were female, so we had mostly female respondents. And interestingly, over 2/3 had 10 or more years of teaching in higher ed, so lots of teaching experience. However, only most of them had not taught an online course before the transition. So while they may have had good teaching experience, teaching online was new to about 63% of our respondents. For the student completers, so the inclusion criteria, once again, included the informed consent, and they needed to complete at least 63% of the survey questions. We had over 3,600 student completers from across the state of Georgia. And I will say the majority of the student completers were at Georgia State with the highest response rate. But we are also the largest institution in the study. Almost 86% of them were undergraduates, and then the remaining were either graduate or non-degree students. So you can see a lot of the student respondents were undergrads. So 3/4 of them were female, and the vast majority were full-time students. In looking at the instructors who completed the survey, most of them transitioned 1 or 2 courses. So about 65% of them completed 1 or 2 courses, and only about 5% actually completed 6 courses. So you can sort of see the distribution and the number of courses that instructors completed during the end of the spring 2020 semester. In all, our survey looked at 1,444 transitioned courses. So the responses came from 1,400 courses. Once again, as I mentioned earlier, most of the students who filled out the survey were undergraduates, which makes sense that most of the courses that were described in the study were undergraduate courses. So 87.5% were undergraduate, and the remaining were either graduate or non-degree students. And interestingly, too, I found that 64% were courses required for a major. So what this means was that most of these were kind of upper division courses. And we believe that almost every type of course or instructional setting was represented in the survey. We didn't quite ask about this, but we do think that this included, based on responses, this included a variety of different types of courses that could be tagged in our system, such as service learning courses, all the variety of different kinds of courses that we could have. And also, we do know that 100% of the course responses were regarding face-to-face courses before the transition, and that they were all 100% remote or online after the transition. So what were the predominant modalities, online modalities after the transition? About 52% were entirely asynchronous. So they lacked any type of real-time component in the online setting. So most were asynchronous. And then that was followed by mostly asynchronous with some synchronous component. And this was happening because most of the guidance that was given to us by our upper administration, and I think within the university system of Georgia, was try to be more asynchronous than synchronous. And that was related to elements that we could talk about later with bandwidth and student scheduling. We're going to cover 6 key findings and then get back to our one-word exploration. But our first key finding was that instructors expressed that before the transition, they thought that they were adequately prepared. And when looking back, they believed that they were adequately prepared and ready for the transition. So this graph just shows what they were thinking before the transition, before they started teaching, and immediately after it was over. And you can see that, almost 44–45% agreed and thought that they were adequately prepared to teach. And then after that, almost 20% strongly agreed that they were prepared to teach during the remote instruction period. However, that contrasts the key finding from students who described that they were not adequately prepared before the transition, and that when they thought back about it later, they thought they were even worse shape than they were initially. So with this graph for student data, we can see that there were, as a large percentage of students, 23% of students thinking back strongly disagreed with being adequately prepared. And about 50% of the respondents were in the strongly disagree and disagree categories. And the agree dropped when they thought back about what that experience was like for them at the time. So it went from being 27% down to 18.7%. So while faculty were feeling slightly more positive, students actually ended up having a more negative view of what they experienced during the rapid transition to remote instruction. A third key finding was that instructors made numerous modifications to assignments, assessments, and grading. And what we saw from this, almost 84% of the courses had some type of syllabus modification. Just over 10% actually added more assignments, but many of those were actually low stakes assignments, and 36% of the courses actually dropped assignments. And that the vast majority of courses had modifications in their initial grading systems. So setting up either more graded assessments for 13%, and 28% had fewer graded assignments. Our fourth key finding was that instructors viewed that they were less effective as with their teaching capability after the transition. So using a self-definition, they could define teaching effectiveness for however it fit their own teaching personality. We had them compare their effectiveness before and after the transition, and almost 50% of the instructors thought that they were less effective after the transition, and then about 35% thought that they were about the same. Our fifth key finding was that instructors reported strong institutional management and support for the transition. So this was a key finding that was important to me because I did not introduce myself or my colleague at the time, Mike Metzler. We are both, as I said, at Georgia State University, and Director of Center for Excellence in Teaching, Learning, and Online Education. And Mike and I and everyone on our center took key roles in trying to help faculty make this transition. And as I stated earlier, how we could go about that within our own institution could vary, but we were all following the same guidelines that came down from the University System of Georgia. And across all 6 of the institutions that participated in this study, instructors reported strong institutional management and support for the transition. And we can see that here. My institution's leadership provided sufficient guidance for the transition, with the majority agreeing and strongly agreeing with this statement. And this is supported by feeling like they're being provided with adequate resources, training, and technology, where once again, the significant majority said that they agree and strongly agree with those terms, that they were provided the resources and support they needed. I had time to prepare for the transition. So once again, you can see that over 50% of the respondents agreed or strongly agreed with these statements. And at all of the USG institutions, this happened around our spring break period, where we were able to take advantage of spring break. All classes in the USG were paused for at least 1 week. And so instructors got about 2 weeks of time to prepare for the transition. And our last key finding, and this is where these words are going to come in, was it was challenging and very stressful for instructors and for students. This was a challenging time that none of us hope to ever repeat again. And these are just some selected comments from instructors. We had a long list of responses, but we just selected a few. One statement was teaching online. There was little of it. So a lot of instructors did not feel like their transition even mapped onto how they viewed themselves as an instructor. Instructors were concerned about academic dishonesty. They had a hard time creating a sense of community in their classes. They described challenges with bandwidth, both bandwidth in the technological sense, bandwidth with regards to how our learning management system, Wi-Fi capabilities. We use WebEx at Georgia State. WebEx was able to handle this transition. There were a lot of struggles with that, as well as the emotional and cognitive bandwidth of students. And that ties into this comment here. Some students disappeared and had to be prodded to complete the work. That was a very common concern, was that many students just did not re-engage back in the classes when classes resumed fully in a remote fashion. And also family challenges. Instructors described having their kids home as well and having to juggle teaching online plus helping their children succeed in online school. And then students expressed a lot of challenges as well. Very common challenges were, I was too stressed or busy to give enough attention to my coursework. So that also ties to that bandwidth. They just couldn't take on more. Other students described not having dedicated places and where they lived to even be able to log in and focus in their online classes. Some described their instructors not being responsive enough, or they did not have reliable internet access. Even though we tried to check out hotspots and we did as much as we could to get technology to our students, there were still challenges in that area. So the students described a wide variety of challenges to how they adapted to this. They had to work jobs. Some students described being essential workers and needing to go into work. So you put your first word in the chat earlier, but now what I'd like you to do is, looking back on this historic emergency transition, please enter another word that describes what you think now. How would you describe it now? Like thinking back, your thinking back word. So your words that you put in to start this were hectic and chaos and rushed. So, and I would agree, I think we all experienced those similar terms, but now thinking back, I'll see what was transitioned in there. These are, and we'll compare your words to what instructor said at the time and what students said. And when we asked them for their single thoughts, challenging came up from instructors. Chaotic and chaos was one of the words you described. Stressful, frustrating, hectic. But we did get a lot of interesting. We got some successful, some time-consuming, and hectic was one of the words that you described, and you can also see it shows up here. Mike, these were the words that they described, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So hectic was on your list, chaotic, rushed. We can see all of those words are here. What did students say? Students described stressful, challenging, hell, different, chaotic again, boring, difficult, unmotivating. So we can sort of see what the students were describing here. I'll just let you look at those words for a minute. So afterwards, you guys described doable, opportunity, and once again, rushed. So our rushed did not change. So what we can think now is your words definitely took on a more positive tone when you reflect back about how we could actually adapt and what we could learn from this transition to remote teaching. What we also did is we compared instructor unique words to student unique words. The instructors had almost 600 unique words. The top two that were listed were challenging and stressful. Hectic and chaotic also showed up as words, and those were words that you also listed in the chat. And the student words, their top two were also stressful and challenging. And then they just had a variety of different words, where some of them actually said things like good, but a lot of it was horrible, terrible, overwhelming. You can just see the pressure and the stress that everybody was under during this time. So your words that you looked at, hectic, chaos, and rushed, and you transitioned those, Mike, making sure I'm right, doable, opportunity, and rushed again. So you can see how those did not change, but how at least doable and opportunity, as I said earlier, take on a positive feel. But what is also exciting is we want to learn something from this and know what we can do. And even with rushed, it may have been rushed, but that still could have been rushed and still had a positive outcome, or rushed and have a negative outcome. This is our research team. We've got a collection of colleagues who have participated with us in the study. Part of these results have been oh, you lost my screen? I don't know if anyone else can see. Are you back? Am I back?
No, that's the other side. That's it.
Oh, okay. So I don't know. Mike can no longer see my screen, so I'm not sure why. But we are just wrapping up. If you can see the screen, it has. Oh, I'm back. He can now see the screen. Our contact information is here. I'm going to stop sharing and open this up for questions and see if anybody has anything they'd like to add.
Can y'all hear me okay? This is Hillary.
Yes, Hillary, absolutely.
I was having some trouble posting in the chat and I kept getting disconnected and reconnected, so I hope that won't happen again. But I just wanted to say, you know, I followed this study from its beginning, and I was really interested in your results, especially the discrepancy between the faculty and student response. And also, you know, just what I experienced anecdotally, at least at Kennesaw State, there was a whole lot more anxiety and kind of self-doubt than was reflected in your results, just from, you know, anecdotally from the faculty I heard from. And so I'm wondering, did I just hear from those who had a bad experience? You know, it seems like most faculty really rose to the occasion, or self-reported that they rose to the occasion, you know, and actually learned something from the experience. So that was interesting to me.
Yeah, that's a good point, Hillary. And what I don't know is if we were to actually survey again, this was very close after. I mean, everything was very fresh. And I do think if we were to actually survey them now, I would see more self-doubt, I think. And at least some of the colleagues that I've worked with at Georgia State, because this was, you know, they completed the survey May to June 2020. And I think that they were just like in this busy mindset of going to get this done, and you know, I'm trying to get all these things done. I do know at Georgia State we had a all hands on deck getting faculty ready to teach online. Like we ran about 3,000 people through our Mastering Online Teaching course. And I do think that that did help, at least from the GSU respondents, their confidence in teaching online. It was a 4-week asynchronous course that we ran that normally had 30 people in it a semester, and we got every single instructor through it. And it was chaos, but we did it. So I don't know if that helped those respondents maybe feel a little bit more confident, but my view is people realize that their confidence, maybe they still have it with the idea of, hey, I can teach online again in the future, but maybe what I did then wasn't quite the best thing that I did. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point about how, you know, at the very beginning of the pandemic, we did have sort of a collective, we can do this, yes, you know, kind of attitude that maybe as time went on kind of dissipated a little bit, yeah. Especially, you know, now that we're still having some of the same challenges, you know, a year and a half later. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I also think that if we were to survey them in the start of the fall semester, it would have been different. That's where I saw people really plunge in their motivation because they felt like they had less control about what was happening in the fall semester. And they felt like they had more, at least during that remote transition, like I said, all hands on deck, a little bit more control. And I really think there was that feeling of much more discouragement in fall 2020. And if we had asked them then, maybe we would have seen something different. So.
Hi, oh, sorry.
Just need SMAP was sent a full set of the data. And if you wanted to see it parceled out for Kennesaw State, you can ask her.
Thank you. I will. I would love to see that.
Sorry, I keep interrupting you, Hillary.
Oh, no, you're fine. Hi, Michelle. please.
It's hi. How are you?
Yeah,
It's
okay.
early. It's 4:30 in the morning here in Australia.
Oh.
But I wanted to come and see your session because I have to present next. So I wanted to see how it was going, and you've done a great job. I just wanted to mention to you that in Australia, when the pandemic hit in March 2020, our semester had just started. So we were face to face for 2 weeks, and then the universities gave us 2 weeks to flip it to online. So I would have really loved, like, really great thinking to get this data collected at that point in time when all that chaos was happening. And wouldn't it have been really interesting to see from an Australian perspective how quickly it had to happen, how people felt? And then I'd have to say, since we're into the third term of doing this now here, so we're still not back to campus until January next year. It might be interesting again to run the survey one more time further into it and see how people are feeling now, because I think that I've watched it progress from, like you said, chaos to doable, but now we're very much in a phase of, okay, like the novelty is now worn off.
Yes.
I'm ready to see my students again. So it just might be interesting to run it one more time, but thanks for a great presentation.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think it would be so interesting to compare the transition at the beginning of a semester. We were in the middle of our semester, you know, like this was right at the midpoint for us at Georgia State. In most USG schools, it was about the midpoint. But I'm very curious about how students would have done in your perspective, where you had more time to make sure they stayed and engaged. Like, did that help having more time with them after the remote transition? And would you have had more positive responses from students? So that would have been interesting. But thank you, Michelle, for your question. So, and thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. Thanks for Madison for monitoring and getting us all set up.